Hi everybody, my name is Grace Bubeck and this is a live online conversation with Stephan Bodian on the teacher-student relationship, Perils and Promise. He also called it the dark inside the light. And it's a topic that, is really an eternal topic, and as teachers are much more available on the internet, and people feel drawn to teachers, that there always arises this question as to who is trustworthy, and is it even necessary to have a teacher? All those questions. So we'll be in conversation, Stephan and I, about that for the first part of this conversation, and then in the second part, you can ask your questions. So, and I just want to say also that this is taking place in the context of the coronavirus and Europe's being shut down as we're speaking. Many countries already don't allow people to go out. Schools are being closed, and public meetings no longer take place. But we do have the internet, and so we can meet on the internet, which is wonderful. And I just want to say, if you have dear ones that have become sick, we'll just hold them in our prayers. So, and actually the whole globe seems like it needs our prayers at the moment. Yeah. Personally, I'm affected because I was going to go on retreat with my teacher Gangaji, whom I haven't seen for years now, and I didn't feel the need to see her anymore. But it came to see her on a small group retreat in Oregon, and it was cancelled. So that's a very real context that we're all facing.
Yeah, I'm here in Spain, and the country has been shut down as of tomorrow morning for 2 weeks, and it feels like a ghost town, a ghost country.
Yes.
Everyone's off the streets, and the beaches even are closed. So quite unprecedented. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So the internet is a way of meeting also.
Yeah, beautiful way to link us.
Yes.
In word and spirit, hopefully as well.
So Stephan, I wonder whether you could start us off with maybe just sharing your experience with teachers. You've had quite a bit.
Whoops, you froze on my screen.
I froze. Here. Well, go ahead anyway.
So I don't know that you can see me, but I've lost you, Grace.
Yeah, for the time being, I've lost everybody, but I can hear you. So just continue, Stephan. Just start with your story. Hello, Stephan. Oh dear, we seem to have lost Stephan. So can people hear me? Can you just give me a nod that you can hear me? Yeah, okay, that's great, wonderful. So until Stephan comes back in, which I hope he will soon, I'll just start off myself. So really, I have had actually very positive experience with my teacher, Gangaji. And the way I came to have a teacher, which is not what everybody does and what everybody needs, but for quite a few years, I actually had teachers that came to me as in spirit. And the first one was Jesus, interestingly enough. And then came Shivananda of the Shivananda yoga tradition. And in a more marginal way, Saint-Germain. And for those years, I was really very content having these teachers present in my life when I was meditating, or you know, they just came when I needed them to. And at some point, though, there was a realization that I needed to, that I needed a real teacher. So in the flesh, as it were, in the body. So at that point, I just put out a prayer that I needed to find a teacher, and searched for a while and had connections with non-dual spiritual teachers to whom I felt drawn at that point. And then what happened is I actually did a retreat with Gangaji's husband, Eli, Jaxon-Bear. And he stopped teaching because at that point, after I'd been on retreat with him, he stopped teaching because it became known that he had had a relationship with a student. And he withdrew from teaching at that point, and I kept getting emails from the Lila Foundation, which is Eli's organization, about retreats that his wife was offering, Gangaji. And I was quite prejudiced about her and wasn't really considering her as a teacher at all. But I was really badly in need of a retreat, and it so happened that she was giving a retreat when I was in Germany, very close to where my parents were living. And so I thought, well, maybe I just need to do this. But you know, I had all these objections to her. I didn't take to her as a person. And so she came to me in a dream and made it very obvious that these were just mind-generated objections. And I couldn't take them very seriously. So I decided to go on retreat, and I just fell in love with her. And there was nothing I could do about that. You know, your heart just opens. And it's such a profound connection that I just had to accept that. And it was a very profound connection for me for several years, in which I was really just in this total openness to these teachings, and they just came in, you know, and I soaked them up like somebody who was very very thirsty, and just you know, taking every drop that she could get, and being so deeply nourished by that. And it's difficult to talk about this because really it's there's something very difficult to name in all this. And in all of this, I didn't have a very close relationship with her. All I did was I listened to DVDs. I watched DVDs, I listened to CDs. I went on retreat once or twice a year as I could afford it. And usually I'd come up to speak with her, but that was the contact I had. And from time to time, I wrote letters to her, and I think I only ever got 2 answers back to like probably maybe 20 letters that I wrote. And they were very short. So really, there was no personal relationship. And I recently spoke in an interview with Pema Dean, which you will find on my YouTube channel. And she has a very personal relationship with her teacher because he has very few students. And that is a very different dynamic than having a relationship that's really, really in satsang only. And so after a few years, it was very clear that I needed to head out on my own, that I needed to find my own languaging and my own way with these teachings, that I couldn't any longer be a student. It was like, it was time to go. And Gangaji's always been very clear about this, that, let me just see, there's somebody. Stephan, are you here?
Yes, I'm here now.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that.
Okay. Well, Stephan, I'm in the middle of sharing my story.
Yes, please.
So I'll just continue and then we'll bring you in after.
Fine, I'm going to get a better microphone. I'll be right back.
Okay. Yeah, so it was time to head out on my own. And this very intense link that I'd felt, this intense connection that I'd felt with Gangaji had really just fallen away. And it was no longer there. It was as if she had stopped being my teacher, and she really, you know, that there's an immense loyalty I feel towards her. But it was very clear that that phase was over. And after that, I had, you know, I watched YouTubes with other teachers, and I went on one retreat with Adyashanti. I did benefit a lot from the inquiry, who am I? And I really, for some reason, that really needed to be done. So for, you know, maybe 1 or 2 years, that self-inquiry was very intense, but it was like me inquiring with myself. You know, I wasn't looking to get anything from a teacher anymore. Other teachers were more like there to maybe just give me a different perspective or different languaging, you know, like a different way of describing things and talking about things. And that's, to me, seemed to be very helpful. So that was really my experience. So, you know, my experience was both very distant with my teacher in the sense that I never related to her as a person. And it was also entirely positive. And it was very real. You know, it was a real connection that had very real and very beneficial effects for me. And that was also very clear when it stopped being that very real connection. So, and I'm very aware that people's experiences can be very, very varied. And, you know, my attitude in this and my understanding is that people really get what serves them. And if it's difficult experiences with teachers, you know, that is a difficult topic. So we'll probably get that. We'll get into that with Stephan. So I think at this point, I'll just hand over to you, Stephan.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Grace. I'm sorry I didn't get to hear that. I don't know what happened. I had to switch devices here. I don't know why one device didn't get good connection and another does, but here we are. So,
Okay,
hi,
so Stephan, you will have to speak slowly because your connection is very bad.
Oh, it is still, really?
Yes, yes,
Oh.
it's very, like, you know, when you move, you kind of move in stages, yes.
Sorry about that. Yeah, you know, I think maybe with this difficulty here with the coronavirus, everything is shutting down. Maybe the internet company is not doing a good enough job. But actually, my download is good. According to this, let me see, my upload, I should have a good connection, really.
Okay.
So I'm not sure why that is, but
well, for now it's okay.
Okay, my internet connection is good, so I'm not sure what's going on. But anyway, here we are in this world of digital connections. So, so I didn't hear most of what you said. So I'm sorry, Grace. Yeah, my own experience. I'll sketch briefly. The reason that I broached this topic. I've written about this topic quite a bit, and I've investigated the topic quite a bit, largely because of my own experiences. And now as a teacher myself, you know, I've been doing this now for, you know, well over 20 years in the form that I'm doing it. And then even before that, I was teaching more in the Zen context. So I know what it's like on both sides, being a teacher and a student. And I know, at least I have a sense of the inherent, some of the inherent difficulties and challenges at both ends. You know, one of the things when we were first beginning today, Grace, that I thought of is, you know, why does someone become a teacher? Why does anyone choose to be a teacher or find themselves as a teacher? I mean, there's a tremendous amount of hubris in that, potentially, right? You know, I have some understanding, so I'm going to set myself up as a teacher. Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So where does it come about, or how does it come about that someone even becomes a teacher? You know, I would say that very often there is, you know, a good possibility that there's some ego in it, right? You know, the adulation of one's students, you know, is very, it can be very intoxicating, and people who have a tendency toward narcissism, as we all do, to a greater or lesser degree, can find that very fulfilling in that it can create a kind of ego inflation, right? A sense of one's own self-importance that can be masked by a semblance of no self or a semblance of egolessness. But in fact, in the shadows, the dark inside the light, the ego is in fact being fed, right, by this position. So, you know, how do you end up a teacher? You know, in my own case, I didn't really set out to be a teacher. You know, I set out to be a student, and I was a very diligent student for many, many years, both as a Zen monk for 10 years, and then as a very devoted student of Jean Klein for another 10 years. So in that sense, you could say I sat at the feet of teachers and paid my obeisance, you know, and my respect and devotion to teachers over many, many, many years. I'm not saying one has to do that, but that just happened to be my path. I never felt that I was, worthy to be a teacher, But then it seemed that somehow I was called to be a teacher by my teachers. And so it came about. So I think to begin with, those of us who are teachers and those of us who are students might be a little sort of inquisitive as to how does it even come about that one becomes a teacher? And by implication, what is then the role of a teacher, right? In the process of a student. Now, in my own case, I had some wonderful teachers early on. Suzuki Roshi, Zen Master, was a beautiful teacher who I was with for about a year, and then had another teacher, Kobun Shino, another Zen teacher, who was quite an eccentric guy who had no pretensions himself to be a teacher. He sort of really shunned the role as much as he possibly could. He would often say things like, don't ever call yourself a Buddhist, He didn't like the labels and the roles, He was really an unusual kind of teacher. But then I found myself drawn to a teacher, also a Zen teacher, who very much took on that role of teacher and relished that role of teacher. Came from a family of teachers. His father was a Zen teacher. His brothers were Zen teachers. And he took on that role quite willingly, but in fact ended up abusing his power. And I saw that unfold as a monk under his tutelage. I watched as he abused his power. I personally was not immediately impacted. He was generally more easygoing with me, in part because he saw me as the teacher of my previous teacher. In Zen, there's a strict, you're either this person's teacher or that person's teacher. So, but I saw how he acted, with a certain arrogance, and he was also an alcoholic. And as it turned out, he was abusing his female students as well, sexually harassing them, and ended up having a long-term affair with one of his senior students who was married, and he was married. So I watched that unfold. Again, I wasn't particularly traumatized by that, but I found it fascinating and disturbing, right? So I left that teacher in that community largely because of what I was seeing, and because of my own concern that I was being groomed to be a teacher. I was one of the senior students. I was a monk. He was more and more putting me in positions of authority, in which I was doing teaching myself and doing interviews with students. And I felt that I wasn't ready. You see, I felt that given what I was seeing, I felt that it would be presumptuous and dangerous of me to put myself up as a teacher. So I left and went back to school to study psychology, because I felt like I needed to understand my own psyche. I needed to understand the psyches of my students before I played with fire, before I took on the role of teacher, which I felt was inherently potentially dangerous, right? One of the teachers in that lineage, an American who I got to know somewhat, Eitan Roshi, said at one point in one of his books, I think it was The Mind of Clover, that a teacher represents a whole world of meaning for the student. Teacher represents a whole world of meaning. So a student comes to you and sees you as the representative of a whole world of meaning that they've come to understand and immerse themselves in and to realize. And then when you betray that trust and you act in ways that are out of integrity with the teaching, their connection with the teaching and with the truth of their own being is threatened, is undermined, right?
Yeah.
That was why I left, and then I had a relationship, a brief 2-year relationship with another teacher in the Tibetan tradition, who has subsequently been proven to be not only abusive, but also had to have misrepresented his own understanding and training, who I also saw abusing his students. And this time I left pretty quickly because it was more obvious to me this time what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And
do you want to maybe just mention the name?
Well, yeah, it's no secret anymore. Of course, Sogyal Rinpoche, who subsequently it turned out, and there's been a book written about him. Subsequently, it turned out didn't even have the training that he purported to have, and probably wasn't even qualified to be doing the teachings that he was doing. But beyond that, I saw him act abusively toward his women students, not sexually. I didn't see that. And again, I was not abused in any way. I was given preferential treatment in a lot of ways. But I saw him getting angry, and I saw him pushing his female students, using their time and their devotion in ways that I felt were self-serving. And so I left him within a couple of years. I actually wrote him a long letter, and he never responded. And I thought, okay, that's clear. So I left. And then I discovered Jean Klein, who was a great master, and I would say lived in complete integrity. And I was with him for 10 years again. And then I met.
And who's well known for having refused to be a teacher.
Yes,
all the while teaching.
That's right. What Jean used to say, and one of the things that drew me to Jean Klein was he said, when a teacher who does not take himself to be or herself to be a teacher meets a student who does not take him or herself to be a student, and this brings tears to my eyes, the purity of these words, then true transmission can happen. Neither one taking themselves to be anybody, any role at all, just to be nobody, meeting nobody in that interaction, in that alchemy, a true transmission of understanding, of realization can take place. So, a beautiful teacher, and the teacher with whom I had my primary awakening and subsequent awakening. So, utmost gratitude for Jean Klein. Without whom I don't think I would have awakened. So here's the other side, right? The relationship with the teacher was a powerful catalyst for my own awakening, in the words and also in the silence more than anything else. For me, I felt the silence with Jean was really fertile and palpable, and there was a tremendous amount that was being transmitted beyond the words. And then Jean died in 98. 99, I met Ajahn Shanti. I studied with Ajahn intensively for a couple of years, and then Ajahn said, you're cooked. Go out and teach, So, and that was sort of the end of the formal relationship with teachers. But again, there's this this mixed bag, right? On the one hand, teachers have this tremendous power often to awaken us through the quality of their presence. Yes. On the other hand, there can be all manner of ways that they can misuse their power, and and that's something we can explore more. I mentioned narcissism. We can talk about that. So wherever you'd like to go with this, Grace, let you lead.
I'd like to maybe just dive into, because a lot of this has been discussed already. So maybe I'd just like to kind of maybe
I wouldn't say that necessarily. I wouldn't presume that.
Right. Okay.
And that's why we're here. I don't feel it has been discussed adequately, actually.
Okay. Well, you can always come back to other issues that you want to kind of bring in or add in. And I'll just
Yeah,
trust
one of the
where.
things is we talked about it before,
Yes.
and I think there's a tendency, since we talked about it before, to think that it's been talked about, and like we talked about. So I think it's important that we include it here again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So.
Well, is there something that you want to address right now that you feel is really
Yeah, I
so
think,
important that it needs to be said?
Well, that's what we're here for, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I would say that the issue of narcissism, is a big one. As long as we have an ego, there's a certain amount of narcissism, right? Narcissism means putting oneself before others, and there are many facets of narcissism and many levels of narcissism. But I would say that there's a certain close fit between narcissism and being a spiritual teacher. Again, people who are narcissistic are drawn to be in positions of power. They're drawn to be in positions where other people look up to them and see them as special. So that someone who already had a narcissistic bent, and again, narcissism, people who are narcissistic tend to have an exaggerated sense of their own self-importance, right? They tend to consider themselves entitled to special treatment. These are some of the qualities. And again, this is a spectrum. They tend to lack empathy to a greater or lesser degree. People like that can be drawn to be spiritual teachers and can seem to have special qualities because, for example, someone who has a great deal of equanimity may seem like a deeply awakened person, but on the other hand, it could be that they're just not very empathic and they don't really care so much, And I've seen that with certain teachers, It seems like they have tremendous equanimity, but in fact, they don't really care about what other people feel, And then another piece of this is that when people do wake up to the truth of their being, it's very tricky not to identify with that as one's possession. I wake up, I am that, I am consciousness itself. But no, consciousness is you, but you are not consciousness. You see, it's easy to become identified with I am consciousness, with the emphasis on the I. A narcissist finds that very easy to do, see? And then the awakening can fuel a narcissistic tendency, right? So I think we need to really be careful in assessing, evaluating, checking teachers out. There's nothing wrong with this, We shouldn't feel reluctant to really trust our intuition, I've heard people I've worked with say, I could sense that there was something off, but I didn't trust it, So I think, and of course, there's a tendency with teachers to be the teacher will invite you to suspend your beliefs, suspend your judgment, let me guide you, But in fact, I think we never should abdicate our own inner guidance, our own inner judgment, even with a teacher, The Dalai Lama has said that students should check a teacher out for several years before they really choose to commit to studying with them. So I think it's really good to really check in, watch the way the teacher behaves with their students, watch the way the senior students behave, how do they reflect the teacher, and again, trust your inner knowing, your intuition. So I don't think we can say that enough, because I still meet people who've given their power away and somehow thought that was what they were supposed to do or what would be beneficial for them. And by and large, I don't think it is really. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, Stephen, I totally agree that it's really important um, to stress those things, those issues, and at the same time, you know, ego being what it is, and of course, you know, spiritual seekers have an ego too. They're
We all have
narcissistic.
ego.
We all do. So we want something from a teacher, right? So it's like, and that very wanting something from a teacher actually prevents the true transmission. As you know, you mentioned Jean Klein saying. So it's a very tricky, you know, for me, it's really a very tricky issue. Yes, we have to be really listening in with ourselves about what's happening and to be truthful about that. At the same time, there is a place for, how shall I say that? There is a place, and I know I've benefited a lot from that, where I really did suspend my own judgment. And I had to, because my own judgment was, you know, it was limited. And the very devotion to my teacher allowed those limitations to fall away, you know. So it is a very tricky thing. And because we come with such mental limitation to a teacher. And you can see this when you're in a teaching role, you can see those very limitations in the people who come to you, who work with you, you know. And to me, it's really a question of finding ways for people to encourage people to let go of those presumptions, of those mental, you know, categories that they're using for themselves and that limit them, while at the same time, while at the same time staying close to their own knowing, deeper knowing, not the knowing in the, you know, in the rational mind. That to me is really you know, the tightrope that we're walking.
I would agree. I would agree. I think that I mean, I think the role of the teacher is to help a student connect with their own inner teacher, see, not to become the authority for the student, you see. And if that requires that the student give up and let go of their beliefs, absolutely, you know, as long as they're being led back to their own inner knowing. That's what a teacher points to. That's what a teacher represents, you know. The problem is when teachers become the experts on students' lives, not just their spiritual lives, but their sexual lives, their financial lives, their you know, work lives, you know. That is not the province of teachers, you know. You know, the province of teachers is to challenge your belief system, and to encourage you to discover the place where you know beyond the mind, you know, beyond knowing, beyond knowledge, right? I'm sure you agree. So, you know, that's the role of teacher. The problem becomes when the teacher starts becoming the expert on everything for the student and starts expecting the student to defer to the teacher in every regard, right? I think that's never appropriate, frankly. I would say across the board. I don't think it's ever appropriate. I think there needs to be some kind of boundary there. For a teacher to tell a student what to do with their lives, I personally don't think I think that's dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah.
The student needs to choose. And, be encouraged by the teacher, but, there has to be an ongoing process of saying yes on the student's part again and again and again, not the teacher leading them along. So I suspect we agree on that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's it's sometimes very difficult because, of course, students want you to tell them what to do. That's part of the trickiness of this relationship.
It's not so tricky, actually, in my experience as a teacher. You just hand it back to the student. You just don't take it on. And I think those times are very clear, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And the teacher can choose in those moments to overstep their bounds. It's very tempting to do that, because you think you presume to know better. Gee, I know so much spiritually, maybe I must know better in so many ways. I think that's a mistake. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think it's clear to a teacher in the moment when that's happening. But the best answer is, I don't know, you probably know better. It's your life. All I can do is offer you some spiritual wisdom here.
Yeah.
I mean, if someone says, "What's your opinion?" Well, I can offer my opinion, but it's none of my business really what you do. In that regard. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I would say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you can feel it. See, that's the thing. As a teacher, you can feel people coming with their devotion and their adoration and their love and all I want to do when I feel that is turn the mirror back. This is you're talking about. This is your own essential nature that you're devoting yourself to, not to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the teacher's role.
Yes. So the
other thing that Jean-Paul said was, as soon as a teacher wants to have students, then we're in trouble, basically.
Yes.
Beware the teacher who's, attached to having students. My students.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There are no my students. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're just people who come to us and seek some sort of helpful guidance in the moment. Yeah.
I have two questions for you, Stephan. I wonder what you think about that, or what your experience with that is. One is, seems to me that in this spiritual searching, there is a phase where our own nature is projected out onto a teacher, and it's almost like inevitable. And as long as it's projected out, there is a benefit from being a devoted student. I mean, I would say I've had a lot of benefit from that phase.
It's an interesting conversation. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. Yeah.
Yeah, I can go to my next question after.
Okay, yeah, okay. So interesting, because I had the same conversation with someone someone who hosts one of my satsangs here in Spain, and she said the exact same thing, and I know that there is this tendency to project in any relationship. I mean, Jung talked about this actually at great length in terms of any, interpersonal, like a romantic relationship. There'll always be projection, always, and that you re-own the projection, right? And I think it is helpful. In a sense, what you're projecting is your very own true self.
Yes.
I mean, you're projecting your very own true self, you could say the guru principle, onto the so-called guru. Mm-hmm. I think, anyway, this is just my own opinion and my own experience, that my job is to give it back, is to reflect back whenever it feels appropriate and as soon as I possibly can, that this is your own true self that you're projecting onto me. I don't have to say that, but energetically, if I don't buy it, then it's going to go home again. It's going to come back home again. And the things that I say and the way that I teach are all designed to return that projection back to the student. I think that's the most skillful and most effective way to deal with that. And I understand the impulse. Absolutely. You know, I've done it. Of course I did that with my teachers, of course. But I never had a teacher who, except for, you know, I think Maizumi Roshi and Sogyo Rinpoche, you know, who I left as quickly as I could, fortunately. The other teachers that I had, the ones that were really, the ones that deeply moved me and facilitated my awakening, were ones that had no interest. Ajashanti, Jean Klein, Koben, Suzuki Roshi. It was clear. In fact, that's why I went to be with Jean Klein. You know, when I met him, I could feel this wisdom, and you know, I thought, whatever this guy has, I want that. Even though he wasn't a Buddhist, you know, I'd been a Buddhist. And then when I sat with him for the first time individually, just the two of us, it became very clear to me that this guy has absolutely no interest in my being his student. And I thought, wow, I want to study with him, because the last two teachers I'd been with, it was clear that there was a hook. You can feel the hook. You can feel that they're pulling on you energetically, you know? And I ultimately learned that that was not healthy in my experience, which is why I'm so insistent and dedicated to giving it back.
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting issue to me, because do you think there's a place for a teacher just allowing that projection for a while? Because, you know,
Yes.
it's like, well, you know, they just see that it's needed. You see that it actually it serves to highlight something.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Maybe wouldn't be quite so clear otherwise. If you
I agree
send it back immediately, you know, it's like, and they don't find that clarity in themselves, then it's not necessarily all that helpful, is it?
Yeah, I agree. You don't have to throw it back, but the main thing is don't accept it.
Yes.
You know, don't take it as having anything to do with you.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Well, that's clearer. You know, that basically now then what we're saying is the trap for the teacher is really to take it personally. That this is really about them as a person rather than about the role they have as a teacher.
Absolutely. That's right. Exactly. Yeah. You know, and it's the same in psychotherapy. You know,
that was, Stephan, that actually was my second question.
Yeah.
But do you find there is a difference, because you're a psychotherapist too, and you know, I'm a therapist as well, and I find it's very interesting that parallel between, you know, the dynamics of the relationship between clients and therapists, because also there needs to be this clarity that,
and there needs to be this projection. So I think you know, a certain amount of transference. You know, you know how it is. If you're working with a client and there's a positive transference, they see you as potentially helpful, as caring. Then the therapy is going to go well.
yes,
and you want that. You know,
it is necessary. You know,
necessary. And of course, in some traditions, you interpret the transference from the very beginning. But in my experience, if it's a positive transference, you just don't have to talk about it. It's great. It's beautiful. That's going to facilitate change. If there's a negative transference, then maybe you talk about it, because that may interfere with their being able to receive what you have to offer. But a positive, so same with a teacher. But do I take it personally that my clients are in love with me or care about me or, see me as special? No, of course not. That is helpful for them, because then what they receive from me is valued and taken in and helpful for them. So yes, we would agree.
Yeah. Stephen, it just occurs to me, there is something so, and I find when you're with people as a therapist from a non-dual perspective, there's something very interesting that happens. It's like, in a therapy context, what clients really are looking for is the parental love that they never got.
Often, yeah.
But really often, yes. Really, when that love is not a personal one, so much as it's held in this larger knowing, it comes from this larger knowing. It's almost like that transmits itself to the client. It's I find that very fascinating.
Yeah, beautiful.
How
they're getting the big love.
Yes, exactly. And actually I found that more powerful than the kind of personal love they were looking for.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, it's like, I cannot take credit for this, because this is just what is.
That's right. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
So the other thing, in addition to the narcissism, we talked about narcissism, is that oftentimes when a teacher, abuses their power or goes astray or doesn't live in integrity or alignment with what they teach, it's because of their own lack of spiritual maturity. So it may not be something as pernicious as narcissism, it simply may be that they haven't fully embodied the truths that they've realized at some level. They haven't fully embodied them. They're not living them fully from the heart or fully from the belly in their actions in everyday life. And I think it's important for a teacher to be aware of the ways in which they're not fully embodying. I think once you've awakened, it becomes pretty obvious when you're not living from it, sometimes painfully obvious, but I think it's important for a teacher to be aware of that and not be unconscious to their own lack of integration.
Yeah.
But so that, of course, and that is understandable, teacher may have some very clear awakening and be able to talk about it in some very articulate ways and helpful ways, but not have fully embodied it. There may be some spiritual bypassing, which of course, spiritual bypassing has gotten a bad rap in the non-dual world, but a certain amount of spiritual bypassing is necessary. Otherwise we wouldn't wake up,
Yeah.
We wake up by kind of doing an end run around some of the unresolved issues, and then we come back to work with them, right? And they may not be worked through. It's understandable. So in that sense, it's not necessarily a pernicious thing, a malevolent force here at work. It just maybe they're not fully mature, and it's understandable. But I think a teacher needs to be aware of the ways in which they're not integrated, and to make room for that, and to acknowledge that. So if someone says to you, I think you're acting in angry ways to us students here, the teacher can say, yeah, you may be right. For a teacher to be willing to be vulnerable, to be human, and not have to live on a pedestal all the time,
Yeah.
In other words, not be invested in the idealizing projections and transferences of the students, So in that sense, a teacher will naturally give back the projections when they act like a human being. If they allow themselves to act like a human being, see?
Well, I think, you know, when there is, when that feedback comes back, or you see it yourself, you know, the question is, what do you do with that, you know? And often people, teachers who are abusive, they'll just find excuses, or they'll say, oh, that's part of the teaching, you know. And really, as a teacher, if you're in integrity, or as a therapist, you know, for that matter, same thing really. When there is a feedback that questions something that one has done, or has, you know, is doing, then that needs to be taken very seriously, you know. And to me, the mark of a teacher in integrity, or therapist in integrity, is that they really listen at that point, you know. They don't explain it away or justify it, but they actually start listening.
I totally agree. Totally agree. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm at some, you know, we're on the hour. I think we should probably open the floor to questions.
Sure.
Okay. So just to say, if you have a question, you can raise your hand by clicking on the participants button, and there's a little hand. You can click on that, and I'll see that you're raising your hands. Or you can also bring on your video and just wave to me, and I'll see you, and I'll unmute you. So let's see, are there any questions? Ben, okay, Ben, I'm going to unmute you. There you are, you're unmuted. Yes, hi Ben.
Hi. So I really appreciate this conversation. It was very salient right now. I guess I'll just sort of outline. I feel like I've had very good luck and I think radar in terms of teachers that I have gravitated towards. And I think I've sort of steered away, spotted some folks that seemed like they were bad news and steered clear. But over the last couple of years, I've found myself in a situation that feels a little more ambiguous with someone who I think genuinely has some important things to offer that are in many ways like really underemphasized in the sort of larger non-dual space in terms of sort of how realization moves in an individual life. And there is an uneasiness that I feel with this person. I don't see overt abusiveness, but I see a certain degree of kind of authoritarian tendency. And I sort of decided to cease contact with that person maybe a couple years ago. And then just in the last like month or two, this person works primarily through dream work. I had a dream that was like quite clearly sort of pointing me back. And I was like, ah, shit, here we go. And it's kind of the same story. Like this person can point out things, I think, that I don't see. And there's some level on which I just don't trust this person. And there was a really marked contrast. I sat in on an Adya broadcast last night, and Adya is somebody who has earned and continues to earn my trust. And I felt actually like quite clearly that trust sort of deepened last night in a way that brought up like mistrust, you know? And that it's like, okay, in this situation, like I feel safe enough with this person to like stay in that and like be like, okay, let's this is an opportunity to work through that. And so it just was a contrast to this other situation. And I guess my question is, there's clearly something in me that's pinging on something being off here. And it also seems like there's something in me that is pointing me towards this person. And so I don't really know how to kind of ride the rail here, if at all. it feels tricky. And I'm curious about thoughts or input. Whoop, I can't hear you. Stephen, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I don't know how that happened.
Do you want to, I had to unmute you because there was a lot of noise coming from your mic, so.
Oh, interesting, there's nothing here. It must be just the static on the line. Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah, Ben, I think, we can certainly learn from teachers that we don't entirely trust, right? So if you're able to, take in the nuggets of wisdom that this person has to offer, but don't give up your power to this person and are discriminating and discerning as you move along, then, I suspect you'll be able to do fine, just stay awake, and don't give up your own power, which again, I would recommend in any case. But again, there may be things to learn here, but just tread carefully. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Does that make sense? Does that resonate?
It does.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Ben, I maybe would just add to that. How to say this? Hold on. Oops. Maybe your dream was not so much about you going back to that teacher, but more about, and that's really for you to feel out in relation to this dream, was it really pointing you back to that teacher, or was it coming up as a way of bringing up this topic of which teacher you trust and which you don't?
That's very fair. And I do wonder, I was interacting with this person last week, and the word that just kind of came to me, and I don't know, I didn't have a sense of what it meant, but the word was closure. And so I wonder if part of this re-engagement has been about finding a sense of closure for that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to kind of stay open to that possibility without putting too much on it. Yeah,
because also, the intelligence that is there, it tends to work, when we approach a topic like this, and you are going to be in this online event on that topic.
Mm-hmm.
It's like often when clients come, they'll have and they have a session that day, they'll have a dream in the night or something that just kind of points them to something, and you can't take these dreams literally. It's just that they bring up the topic. And they invite you to really kind of take note and have a look. But it's not necessarily the content of the dream that gives you the answer. It's more like it's more like a suggestion to you, like really check that out for yourself. And and this is where I think it's where the giving it back is important, because really you already felt that Adya was a trustworthy teacher, right? And you were going to bring this up today, maybe or maybe not, but you did. So it's like all of this points you back to your own felt sense of this teacher not being fully trustworthy for you.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's really all that needed to be known.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I don't know. It's really for you to know ultimately.
Yeah, there's something in there. Thank you.
Yeah. Stephen, do you want to add anything to
No, nothing.
Okay. So thank you, Ben. That was a good. It's a good example of how there can be a lot of knowing in you, you know, that's already very clear. And sometimes all you need is to hear that that's totally trustworthy, you know, it's worth taking seriously. Okay, so I'm wondering, is there anybody else who wants to ask a question? Do we have any other hands being raised? Doesn't look at, yeah, okay, Sherry, I'm going to unmute you. There you are. Hi, Sherry.
Hi, I just want to thank Ben for asking that question. I guess you mentioned like a knowing that it was time to leave a teacher and you know, and make a change. And what that was one question I had, and also how to work through the projections. So sometimes if you work through the projections, you might not need to leave. So I just thought perhaps you could talk about that a little more.
Well, maybe I'll just say what comes to me from my point of view. You know, it's interesting. I think sometimes the relationship to the teacher just changes. You know, the projections start changing because you start seeing, you know, there are awakenings, and you start seeing in yourself what you've projected onto the teacher. You know, it starts to become real in you. And then, of course, there's no need to leave the teacher. You know, it's just that you'll be with the teacher in a different way. The relationship changes because you're no longer kind of putting them on the pedestal and yourself kind of, you know, at the pedestal. Is there a way of working through the projections? Well, you know, that's a good question. Stephan, maybe I'll bring you in on this. Do you have a ready answer to this?
Well, I think the way to work through a projection is to see it as a projection. And you know, once you've seen it as a projection, then it no longer appears to be true, and so it's lost its hook, its validity. That, you know, that's what I would suggest. And then maybe you can have a real relationship with the person, you know, without the projections. As you said, you can continue to be a student of this person without the projections. That's even better, right? The projections clearly aren't necessary if you have a relationship with that person. Quite the contrary, you can see them as they are with their limitations and their, you know, human shortcomings, and at the same time learn from them what you need to learn, right? So I think that's certainly possible. Probably the best possible outcome, actually. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Sherry, do you want to come back on that?
Well, the thing is, the question then is like, okay, when it's time for closure of a relationship versus staying in. So like, if let's say you take back the projections and they're like a human, it's sort of like more like a friendship. It turns into a friendship, you know, or what is it? Because teacher.
Well, it may not turn into a friendship. You know, you'll see what it turns into. It will turn into something more real, though, not based on idealization, right? You may still be that person's student, you know, but without the idealization. I mean, it may not be a friendship, you know, because they have certain wisdom that you want to imbibe, and you know, you continue to respect them and honor them as a teacher, but you're not projecting a whole lot of stuff onto them, you know. You know, and then maybe it means closure too. It could, but you'll then see, because it will then turn into something more real based on some real assessment of the situation, you know. And then who knows what it'll turn into? You can't anticipate, right?
Yeah, I think that's important to to realize that, you know, you can't know what it's going to be.
Good point.
Yeah, you don't need the projection. Yeah, I think that's important. Yeah, feel free to let it go. Yeah, something sweet, of course, about projecting all, you know, idealizing a teacher. You know, there's something very, you know, we get to feel very special about ourselves, like we were talking about before. If we idealize the teacher, then we can see ourselves as being very special for having such an amazing teacher. You see, when we actually see the teacher as they are, which they may continue to be a wonderful teacher, but we're not idealizing them, then it brings it down to the more ordinary, which we may not want. You know, we may resist that. Idealization there's something appealing about it, you know. It's like being intoxicated, right?
It's also very powerful, you know.
Yeah, it's powerful, but it can be also, like you said, problematic.
Yeah, it's you know, it's also a trance, but you know, it can be a
It's a
useful
trance.
one for a
It is
while.
It's an altered state.
Mm.
It's like being in love, right? It is being in love, actually. You know, and we have the honeymoon period in which we, you know, see the other person as infallible and idealized, and then after a while that wears away, and we see the person as they are, and hopefully the relationship, you know, withstands the end of the idealization and turns into something more real. That's what we want.
Mm. So are you good with that, Sherry?
Yeah, no, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you for that question.
Good question.
It's very good. Yeah. So let's see. Any other questions?
Anything else we haven't explored, Grace, that you would like us to explore?
Yeah, there is something that that I think could be helpful, maybe for us to say something about. And it's the topic of, you know, how human a teacher allows themselves to be, and how human they are. You know, like it's very easy to kind of just be in the when you're in a teaching or a therapist role, to be in the very pure aspect of love or light or truth. It's much more tricky to be both that, because that is your role, and also to be very human. You know, to kind of allow that to be visible and to flow into the role. And you know, personally, I'm kind of still finding my way with that, and I was wondering whether you had anything to say about that, Stephan.
Well, again, if you're not playing a role, then your humanness will very naturally arise, right? You say it, you know, difficult, as if we're controlling the situation and preventing our humanness from showing. I mean, is that what we're doing as teachers? And I don't think so. I hope not.
No, that would be a misunderstanding. What I meant is the very role puts you into a certain kind of energy.
Yeah, it does. It has a certain energy to it. I mean, when we're teaching, you know, I would say that certainly my experience is that we're a vehicle. We're being used, you know, we're a vessel, a vehicle for truth, you know, and I often say, you know, I just, in this lifetime, I'd like to be well used, you know, let the truth use me in whatever way it possibly can. It doesn't belong to me. You know, I am not the truth, you know, any more than anything is the truth, but I'm just a vessel for the truth to speak, you know, to express itself, right? And when we teach, I think we're taken over by that energy often. And so then we naturally become a more, as you said, which is a beautiful word, a more pure expression of that.
Yeah.
That's not playing a role, that's just what happens. And that's very natural. But I think
yes,
that
but it's part of that, it's part of that role, isn't it? I mean, the role brings that with you. It's not that you're making this happen, it happens.
Sure, it happens.
And then the humanity kind of tends to fade.
It may, yeah, I guess it may. But I think what's important is that we're not in control. And and I have no doubt that the humanity will shine forth in whatever way it does quite naturally, without our having to calibrate how much of our humanity we show. So in other words, that's not an issue. It's going to show or it's not going to show. And as long as we're not controlling anything, it's going to, it'll manifest in the way it does. We don't have to try to show more humanity in order to show our students our humanity. Again, that would be manipulating the situation. It's like, here I am. This is what I'm offering. That's all. If the humanity shines forth, it does, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. I mean, it certainly does, because we're not perfect. And as vessels, we're just that, just a vessel. Any vessel or vehicle is imperfect.
Yeah. I didn't mean I didn't mean that we try to anything, but
well, I didn't imply
there's there are moments where there's choices, where, for example, I noticed that sometimes it's, that say a student asks a question, right? You can give a personal answer. You can say, well, my experience was this, or you can give a general answer.
True.
So there's always choices that we make about, answering or bringing in what's very, what is very pure, or also bringing in personal experience.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, isn't it? Yeah, we are choosing in the moment. It's like what perspective to come from. I mean,
exactly.
You can come from the more absolute place or the more personal, individual,
yes,
relative place. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
And my experience, I don't want to generalize it, but my experience is that often that women teachers are more willing to also just bring in personal experience. Oh, there's a question on the chat from Janie. Can you share a time when you needed to go back and clean up something that was not in alignment with the truth?
You mean in terms of as a teacher, you're talking about? I mean,
Janie, do you want to? Well, I think what she's addressing, yes, as a teacher, she says yes.
Yeah, I can't think of anything offhand. Yeah, nothing's coming to mind, really. I can't remember a time when when it was pointed out to me that it was really out of alignment, but so no, nothing comes to mind right offhand.
Well, I know that sometimes when I'm in this role of teacher or therapist, I can, I can see a kind of personal liking of this, what I'm doing, and it's very subtle, and I'm aware of it, and I can see that people can get really into that. It's, it's like a little temptation that's there, and but you know, I don't tend to entertain that very much. It just kind of shows up, and then I say, oh, okay, that's interesting. I'm liking this, and that's as far as it goes.
I
It's
think
like,
just seeing it in the moment is really, again, really all that's, because once you see it, it kind of deflates it, you know, loses its grip, you know. I would say in my own case, what just came to mind was, you know, I remember having a student that I was working with regularly saying, you know, you're coming at, you know, I'm coming to you with all these personal issues, and you seem to be coming at it from an absolute perspective a lot. And that's not so helpful. So I said, yeah, you know, you're probably right. I need to be more in the moment with you, and you know, come down into that more personal space and acknowledge it from that perspective. You know, that balance of how much do you, you know, say, you know, coming from the truth of your being, none of that really matters, or how much do you say, yeah, I can really appreciate how painful that was for you, or that is for you. You know, both are true, right? So sometimes getting that mix wrong and being, you know, confronted on, gee, you know, maybe a little bit too much of the absolute, or, you know, a little more empathy in the moment at the personal level would be more helpful. So.
yeah, so I think, you know, Janie, your question suggests that, you know, there's a need to step back from, you know, the role of a teacher to clean something up. I think there has to have been like real abuse for there to be a real need, like, you know, say Andrew Cohen, you know, really needed to step back and take time out because the whole issue of how he was abusing his power had become so massive. And same for other teachers like Sogyal Rinpoche, you know, when he was finally confronted with his ways, he stepped back from his...
Neither of whom really acknowledged their
yes, which is, you know, part of the problem, I think. But when the awareness, you know, is there in the moment, and there's a, you know, there's just a kind of correction that happens at that point. It's like you kind of see it rising up, you know, and you just kind of go, well, that's okay, but you know, that's not why I'm here. You know,
that's a really good point. See, I think that's what a teacher needs to have, you know, in the moment, you know, to see where you're just moving out of alignment, and in the moment, just simply be attuned to that, and, you know, kind of come back into alignment, you know.
Yeah.
Those who get way off out of alignment, who stray very far from the truth, are just not simply generally aware, or they're not paying attention, you know.
Yeah.
Which is what they're, you know, what they're paid to do. To be attentive that way, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, very good, Grace.
So,
Lovely to
Stephan, we have just a few more minutes. Is there anything that you want to add to what's been said that really feels like it needs to be?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think, again, I just think it's the responsibility of teachers. This is part of the work of being a teacher, is staying attuned to the ways that you may be out of alignment, and to continuing to do the work of coming more and more into alignment in everyday life with the truth that you know yourself to be. That's part of the work, you know. That's, you know, and if you're not doing that, you're not doing your job as a teacher, I would say.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And would you say that's a lifelong work?
It's a lifelong work, absolutely.
That's my experience anyway.
As soon as you hear a teacher who says they're done, you know, I remember once having this conversation with Ajay. It's like it's ongoing. The embodiment is ongoing. Awakening happens in a heartbeat. You know, it's grace. It's given. You know, happens out of nowhere, and it's a beautiful thing. But the embodiment, it's a lifelong endeavor. You know, in a certain way, the practice in the direct approach that we're teaching, the non-dual approach, the practice begins after awakening. you know,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. That's a beautiful word that, you know, embodiment. I mean, it's like maybe not everybody understands that if they don't come from a certain non-dual background. But this beautiful word that really names that also, which is integration, you know.
Yeah, that's what we've been talking about, integration.
Yeah. So just to throw that out, because not everybody may know what is meant by embodiment. So Stephan, I really just want to thank you for
Well, thank
you know,
you.
for bringing up this topic and getting me out of my year-long kind of retirement from doing these online events.
That's great. That's great. It's lovely to dialogue with you, Grace. And, you know, it's nice we kind of complemented one another and, you know, balanced one another. I think that was lovely. So,
yes. No, I mean, I really appreciate that your experience with this topic goes back a long time and you've really reflected on it.
And I might point out that on my website, I have 2 articles that I wrote. One is on narcissism and spiritual teachers, which we talked about. And the other was I wrote an article on sex and teachers in the Buddhist tradition for Tricycle, which was never published, but it was accepted for publication. Never got published. It's on the blog section of my website about that whole dynamic. So people might find that interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks again, Stephan.
Thank you, Grace.
And thank you everybody for attending.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
If you like this conversation and you'd like to go to the website living-from-love.com, you can subscribe to the newsletter and you'll find out what else is happening, when I'm going to do the next live online conversation. I'm also putting up videos at the moment under the heading Seekers Finders, which are interviews with spiritual people on a spiritual journey. So, and they're really intended to be a resource for people to kind of just find out what many ways spiritual journeys can happen. Because there certainly isn't like one way of doing this that's good for
everyone. Is different. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And my web address is stephanbodian.org if you're interested.
Yes. Wonderful. So thank you again. May you be well.
Thank you, everyone.
And trust your feelings about your teachers. That's the most important thing. Take them seriously. Okay.
Okay, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.